7 German fighters appeared above him in tight formation. His fuel gauge hovered at critical. His radio was silent. He did not bank. He did not dive. He maintained altitude and waited. The lead messer rolled into attack position. Still, he waited. What the enemy pilots could not perceive was that this American had been counting seconds since their first appearance. And in his mind, the trap had already snapped shut. Spring 1944. The air war over Western Europe had entered a brutal arithmetic. American bomber streams streaked contrails across occupied France and Belgium each morning. Below them, the remnants of earlier missions littered farmland and forest. The 8th Air Force was losing crews faster than the training commands could supply replacements. For every factory hit, another 36 men vanished into fire or captivity. Fighter escorts stretched their range daily. The P-51 Mustang had given American pilots the reach to penetrate deeper into the Reich, but distance introduced new hazards. Fuel management became a question of life and death. Navigation errors proved fatal, and German fighter tactics evolved with every sortie. The Luftwaffe had learned to observe and wait. They allowed the bombers to pass, studied the escort patterns, then struck the stragglers, the damaged, the ones who strayed from formation discipline. It was efficient, it was merciless, and it worked. At RAF Debden in Essex, the 4th Fighter Group operates from a former Royal Air Force base that still reeks of damp concrete and aviation fuel. Ground crews labor through the night, patching bullet holes and replacing glycol lines. Intelligence officers track loss rates that climb week after week. Pilots write letters they hope will never be sent. The roar of Merlin engines fills the morning air as another mission begins. Pre-flight checks, oxygen tests, gun harmonization verified. Each pilot carries the weight of what the statistics already predict. 1 in 4 will not complete their tour. 1 in 10 will not return today. Among them is a man the squadron has learned not to underestimate, though his demeanor suggests nothing remarkable. He speaks little at briefings. He does not boast in the officers' mess. He listens. He calculates. And when he flies, something in his timing separates him from even the best pilots around him. His name is Captain Robert Johnson. By the spring of 1944, he has survived what most could not. Ground crews know him as the pilot who returned with his fighters so battered that engineers used the wreckage for training films. The armorers know him as the man who counts his ammunition before and after every engagement, tracking usage like a meticulous bookkeeper. Intelligence officers know him as the pilot whose combat reports read like technical manuals, concise and precise. He does not fit the stereotype. He does not seek glory. He does not recount his victories with flourish or bravado. When other pilots gather to relive the day's dogfights, Johnson reviews his gun camera footage in silence, frame by frame, deflection angles, closure rates, ammunition expenditure. What others call instinct, he calls calculation. What others call luck, he calls preparation. Robert Samuel Johnson was born in Alton, Oklahoma in 1920. Dust and open sky, a town where mechanics outnumbered lawyers, and common sense mattered more than pedigree. His father ran a small garage. Johnson grew up with grease under his nails and the logic of machines in his bones. Engines made sense, carburetors, timing chains, valve clearances, all followed rules. If something broke, you found the cause. If something failed, you learned why. He was not a natural athlete. He was not especially social. He read technical manuals for recreation. He understood systems. And when he looked at an airplane, he did not see romance. He saw a collection of components that either worked in harmony or killed you. In 1941, he enlisted in the Army Air Corps. Not out of anger or patriotism, though he felt both. He joined because flying fascinated him the way engines did. It was a puzzle of physics, fuel, and geometry, and he wanted to solve it. Flight training revealed something instructors had rarely seen. Johnson was not the smoothest pilot. He was not the fastest learner. But his precision was unnerving. He flew by numbers. He calculated fuel consumption in his head. He could estimate altitude loss in a turn within 50 feet. Where other cadets relied on feel, Johnson relied on measurement. One instructor noted in his file that Johnson flew like an engineer masquerading as a pilot. It was not a compliment, but it was accurate. By the time he reached combat status and shipped to England in early 1943, Johnson had accumulated hours in the cockpit and a reputation for being unnervingly methodical. He did not drink heavily. He did not chase women in London on leave. He studied after-action reports. He interviewed returning pilots about German tactics. He sketched engagement geometries in a notebook he carried. Everywhere, other pilots considered him odd. Some thought him cold. None thought him a fool. His first kills came in the summer of 1943. Clean, efficient, no wasted ammunition. He maneuvered into position, fired short bursts, and confirmed the result. Then he disengaged and returned to escort duty. No victory rolls, no radio chatter, just the mission. By the end of that year, his tally had grown. So had his understanding of the enemy. He learned to recognize Luftwaffe unit markings from silhouette alone. He memorized the performance envelopes of the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109. He calculated their turning radii, their climb rates, their fuel limitations. He studied them the way a chess player studies openings, not to admire, but to defeat. But there was something else Johnson had learned that most pilots never would. He had learned the value of appearing vulnerable, of looking weak when he was not, of letting the enemy believe they held the advantage until the moment he proved otherwise. It was a kind of patience that required absolute confidence in his calculations. And on a mission in April 1944, that patience would be tested beyond anything he had yet faced. The mission brief was routine: escort heavy bombers to a synthetic oil plant outside Leipzig, provide top cover through the initial penetration, defend against interceptors during the bomb run, and shepherd the wounded back toward the channel. Johnson's flight launched at dawn, 4 Mustangs, each carrying full internal fuel and underwing drop tanks. The weather was broken clouds with visibility good enough for trouble. They climbed through cumulus and formed up over the English coast. Below, the gray water of the North Sea spread like hammered tin. Ahead, the continent waited. Somewhere over there, German radar operators were already tracking the incoming stream. The bomber formation droned eastward at 22,000 feet. Johnson's flight held station 3,000 feet above. The sky was bright and cold. Contrails stretched behind them like chalk lines. An hour into enemy airspace, the first attacks came, Focke-Wulfs diving from high sun. Johnson's element broke to engage. Gunfire stitched the sky. One German fighter spun away, trailing smoke. Another broke off and dove for the deck. Johnson did not follow. His job was the bombers. He reset his position and scanned the horizon. Then his number 3 called out a second wave, Messerschmitts climbing from below, angling for a rear quarter attack on the bomber stream. Johnson rolled his flight into a slashing dive. The Germans saw them coming and scattered. No kills, no losses. The bombers continued unharmed, but now Johnson's fuel situation had changed. The combat maneuvering had burned reserves faster than planned. He checked his gauge, enough to make it home, barely. The bomber stream turned westward after the drop. Flak had claimed 2 fortresses. Another was losing altitude with 1 engine feathered. Johnson's flight moved to cover. That was when his wingman's radio died, then his own, a malfunction or combat damage to the relay aircraft. Either way, he was now flying isolated, hand signals only, and fuel still leaking away with every minute. The crippled bomber fell behind. Johnson stayed with it, weaving above, scanning constantly. His fuel gauge now read below minimum for a safe return. He would have to make a decision soon: abort and head for the coast, or stay until relief arrived. He stayed. 30 miles from the French border, the Germans found them. They came from the north, 7 Messerschmitt 109s in a loose gaggle flying at the same altitude. Not diving, not climbing, just pacing them. Johnson saw them immediately. His heart rate did not rise. His hands did not tighten on the stick. He simply noted their position and began calculating. 7 hostiles, 1 damaged bomber with no defensive formation to fall back on. Johnson's flight was down to 3 effective fighters. Fuel was critical, radio was dead, and the enemy had not yet committed. That last detail told him everything. The Germans were not rookies. They were watching, waiting for the Americans to panic, waiting for someone to break formation and give them an isolated target. Johnson rocked his wings to get his wingman's attention. He pointed at the enemy formation, then tapped his head. Hold discipline, wait. The seconds stretched. The bombers lumbered onward. The Messerschmitts paced them like wolves alongside a wounded elk. One of Johnson's element began to drift forward, instinct pulling him toward the threat. Johnson chopped his hand sharply. Stay. The German formation shifted slightly. Still no attack. They were reading the Americans now, judging fuel states, watching for weakness. And then Johnson saw it. The lead Messer edged forward just slightly, testing. Johnson did nothing. Another few seconds. The German edged forward again. Now 2 of the enemy fighters angled outward, preparing to bracket the escort. Still, Johnson held. His wingman glanced over, confusion visible even through the oxygen mask. Why weren't they engaging? Because Johnson was counting. He was measuring closure rates and fuel states and angles of attack. He was watching how the Germans moved, and he was waiting for the one moment when their confidence would become assumption. The lead Messer nosed down, just 5 degrees, the start of an attack run. Now the others began to commit. 2 broke right, 2 broke left. The gaggle spread into attack geometry. And that was when Johnson moved. He rolled, inverted, and pulled, not toward the closest enemy, but toward the leader, the one who had committed first and deepest. The Mustang dropped like a falcon. Airspeed climbed, 420 knots. The Germans saw him coming and broke hard left. Too late. Johnson had not been reacting. He had been anticipating. He fired a 2-second burst. Caliber rounds walked across the Messer's fuselage. Pieces flew. The canopy shattered. The fighter snapped into a spin and fell away. Johnson did not watch it go. He was already reversing. The two Germans who had broken right were now climbing back, trying to re-engage. But Johnson had calculated their fuel state, too. They had flown out to intercept. They had maneuvered. They were not going to chase a diving target all the way to the deck. He proved it by diving another 1,000 feet. The two Messers hesitated, then leveled off. They had chosen survival over revenge. Above him, his wingman and element engaged the remaining 4. Gunfire flickered. One German broke away smoking. Another tried to loop onto an American's tail and found Johnson climbing back into the fight from below. Johnson did not have the angle for a shot, but he did not need one. The Messerschmitt pilot saw him coming and abandoned the attack. The German rolled away and dove for separation. Now the math had shifted. 7 had become 4. 4 had become 3. And the 3 that remained were no longer hunting, they were calculating their own odds. Johnson climbed back to escort altitude. His fuel gauge showed red, minutes left, maybe 10, maybe less. One of the remaining Germans made a half-hearted pass at the bomber. Johnson turned into him. The German did not press. He pulled up and away. The other 2 had already gone. Johnson reformed his flight. The crippled bomber droned westward, trailing smoke, but still flying. His wingman pulled alongside and gave a thumbs up. The radio was still dead, but the message was clear, they had survived. Johnson checked his fuel one last time. Not enough to reach England. He would have to put down at an emergency strip on the coast. His element leader signaled the same problem. They crossed into friendly airspace 10 minutes later. Johnson spotted the emergency airfield and entered the landing pattern. Gear down, flaps down. The Mustang settled onto the pierced steel planking with barely enough fuel to clear the runway. When he shut down the engine, his hands remained steady. His breathing was calm. He climbed out and walked to the operations tent to file his report. The duty officer asked how many he had claimed. Johnson replied, 1 confirmed, maybe 2. The gun camera footage would decide. The officer asked how he had handled 7 enemy fighters while low on fuel and without a radio. Johnson said he waited until they made a mistake. The officer pressed, "What mistake?" Johnson looked at him. They assumed patience was weakness. They assumed silence was fear. They were wrong. The gun camera footage confirmed 2 kills. Intelligence officers studied the engagement for hours. The geometry was unusual. Johnson had not followed standard tactics. He had not turned on the first threat. He had not engaged the nearest target. Instead, he had waited. And when he moved with such exact timing that the enemy formation unraveled from the inside. One analyst noted that Johnson appeared to have deliberately held fire until the German leader was fully committed to his attack run. Another observed that Johnson's dive had not been evasive, it had been predatory, a calculated intercept based on predictive geometry. They asked him to explain his thinking. Johnson said he had observed how the Germans maneuvered during earlier missions. They followed patterns. They committed as a group once the leader committed. If you eliminated the leader at the moment of commitment, the formation lost cohesion. It was not luck. It was observation, pattern recognition, and the discipline to wait for the right moment, even when instinct demanded action. Within weeks, his method was being taught in briefings. Do not react. Observe. Let the enemy commit, then strike at the decision maker. Johnson's kill count climbed. By the end of his tour, he was credited with 27 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the top American aces in the European theater. But the numbers never mattered to him the way they mattered to others. What mattered was that fewer bombers were lost, that fewer crews died because someone had learned to think instead of react. His squadron mates began to understand what the quiet pilot had known all along: aggression without timing was just noise. Courage without calculation was just death. And in the air war over Europe, where seconds determined survival, the ability to wait was the rarest skill of all. After the war, analysts studied Johnson's combat reports. They found that his average ammunition expenditure per kill was half that of other aces. His fuel management was textbook. His loss rate among pilots flying in his formations was significantly lower than average. He had not flown harder. He had flown smarter. In doing so, he proved that war was not just about bravery. It was about thinking clearly when everything around you demanded panic. Robert Johnson returned home in 1944. He did not write a memoir. He did not tour the country giving speeches. He returned to Oklahoma and lived quietly. He worked as a flight instructor for a time, then moved into aviation management. He rarely spoke about the war unless asked directly, and when he did, his answers were concise, factual, and unsentimental. But those who flew with him never forgot what he had taught them. the best weapon in a dogfight was not the gun. It was the mind behind it. In the decades after the war, air combat evolved. Jets replaced propellers. Missiles replaced bullets. Radar replaced eyesight. Yet the principle Johnson had mastered remained. Patience was still a weapon. Timing was still everything, and the ability to let your enemy believe they held the advantage until the moment you proved otherwise was still the mark of a master. Johnson lived into his 80s. He attended reunions and spoke occasionally to historians. He remained precise, methodical, unchanged by the fame he never sought. When he died in 1998, his obituaries noted his kills, medals, and rank, but they missed the deeper truth. Robert Johnson had not just been an ace. He had been a thinker in a profession that rewarded action, a mathematician in a sky full of chaos. His legacy was not the enemies he shot down, it was the men he brought home. Because in the end, the best pilots were not the ones who flew fastest or fired the most. They were the ones who understood that survival was a calculation, and every second of patience was a second someone else got to live. Johnson knew that and proved it 7 times over in a single fight that should have killed him. The quiet pilot who waited, who calculated, who turned silence into a trap, and when the enemy finally struck, found that the trap had been theirs all along.